Aloha, namaskar, and hello. Welcome to Climate Change Beyond Outrage, where we go beyond outrage to discuss solutions to climate problems facing people, nations, and the world. I am your host, Anu, and I am broadcasting live from Think Tech Studios in beautiful downtown Honolulu, although it looks like we're in the COP21 venue again in Paris. So today's episode is called Beyond Paris, and we're going beyond outrage as usual, but we're also going beyond Paris, both before Paris and after Paris. So let me explain what that means. We're talking about almost a prequel to Paris, which is a prequel to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and we'll talk about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the Ipcc, which came right before the UNFCCC, or the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Okay, so we're talking about that, and we will then talk about the implementation of the Paris Agreement and of the UNFCCC, and then we will talk about renewables and renewable energy. So long before there was a UNFCCC, there was an Ipcc, and to help tell that story, in the studio today, I am honored and delighted to have with me as my guest, Dr. Toufiq Siddiqi. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
He is the adjunct senior fellow at East-West Center and also chairman of the Global Environment and Energy in the 21st Century, which we are calling the GEE 21. It's a Hawaii-based think tank nonprofit organization that has an international board of directors and has focused its work on renewable energy and development, and in general the implementation of the work that he started with the Ipcc. And so we will start at first talking about the Ipcc, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But even before we do that, so before the prequel, the prequel to the prequel, is that we will, I would just like to ask you, Toufiq, we've all watched Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth, and in it he talks very much about how his mentor, Roger Revelle, got him going on this subject. Now, your background is actually in nuclear physics.
Right.
And how did nuclear physics translate to climate change, and what got you started?
Well, I would say that nuclear physics, I was interested in nuclear physics primarily because of its potential for supplying large amounts of electricity at essentially no cost. That was the theory, at least, at the time. And then we ran into difficulties of what happens if a nuclear power plant has an accident, not a very likely occurrence, but one potentially very large drawbacks, effects. So I was interested in finding out what other energy sources were available, what might be their impacts. And when you look at coal and oil, the two more common energy sources, they had enormous impacts in terms of both of the local health, but also of the health of the whole planet in terms of the carbon dioxide emissions. And at that time, people were getting aware of this to some extent, that there was some long-term possibility of climate change. So I got interested in that as a faculty member at Indiana University, where I was working at the time, as associate professor in the newly formed School of Public Environmental Affairs.
And this was when?
This was around 1973, 74.
So this is about 15 years before the Ipcc was formed. So the Ipcc was 1988.
Yeah, right.
And so you were already, and other scientists like you were already talking about this issue, looking at the issue of climate change, and it wasn't really on the media's horizon, but it was certainly very much on your horizon.
Yes, it was just a lot of environmental effects are localized. Of course, the air pollution aspect of using large amounts of coal was obvious already in places like Delhi and Beijing and many other cities. And also, the oil effects of oil spills were also evident in the North Sea and in Alaska. So you're looking at what else could be the impacts of using large amounts of fossil fuels. And then, of course, the most obvious one, which had been talked about by Swedish scientists in the early part of the century, was already climate change, the emission of, they call it the greenhouse effect.
Right.
So
right.
that was already pretty evident. So you're thinking about what we can do about it.
Already thinking about the implementation.
Right.
Whereas at this point, it hadn't really even reached the policy arena. So the policy arena has got a huge lag going, right?
Well, it's fairly common for policy
Yes.
arenas in almost any field.
Right.
That you get into where the public leads the politicians, or the politicians lead the public. Usually it's been a two-way street. Sometimes the public is not very familiar with the science behind it, and they just have to be pushed along by the politicians. That was not happening in all the countries, particularly not in the US.
Right. And so you got into this field, and you were working at Indiana University.
Right.
And how did you get into the IPCC?
Well, I was.
They called you.
I think some of them were. There was only a small community of scientists anywhere in the world who were working on climate change effects. And I just happened to be in the right place at the right time, and some of them were invited to be part of these discussion groups at the time on how should it be set up and what should we be doing.
Right.
And somebody must have put my name in the pool of candidates. So it was a question of not seeking it out, but being one of those who happen to be in the field.
Right. And so we'll just take a brief history of the IPCC so that we can tell our viewers, just give it some context and just what it was, what it is. So it really has been the basis of climate change understanding. And here's a slide of the IPCC organizational structure. And it was set up by the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environment Program. So that's what WMO and UNEP are. And when I mentioned to Toufiq that I had a slide of the organizational structure, he said he would be very interested in seeing that because, of course, as a scientist, he does most of the science work, not the organizational structure and the policy side of things. So this is essentially, looks like they have a plenary and a bureau, and then they have these three working groups that are all supported by a technical unit. So, and then you've got all the authors and contributors right there at the bottom, which to me sounds like it's actually the most important, but then they've put them right at the bottom, which is interesting. So obviously then, Toufiq, you were in that authors and contributors and reviewers section, I would imagine?
Yes, and I was working mainly in the working group 3, mitigation of climate change.
Okay, so you were
These groups were already set up long before.
That's right, yeah. So they were set up right away, and basically, it was set up to prepare based on available scientific information, assessments on all aspects of climate change and its impacts. And generally about 2,000 scientists from about 154 countries participate in that process. The scientists are independently nominated for participation by their own governments, so someone must have nominated you. And all the different fields are represented. It would be interesting, to hear from you what fields were represented back then. Now it seems like they've got the Earth system sciences, meteorology, ecology, economics, engineering, and the social sciences and many more. But I wonder if back then, because I know that there weren't really climate change scientists as such,
right.
So I wonder if back then you had...
We had the same group of basic sciences included. That's meteorology, physics, chemistry, biology, and the other ones that you mentioned are all there. So that's not changed that much, that part of it. It's more a question of a few people in the policy arena were there, partly because IPCC's work was to assemble all the scientific evidence that exists for it, and to keep well away from policy recommendations.
So they wanted, that's right, and that was
Yeah.
its mandate, was
Yeah,
to
right.
bring that information together, not to
And
be
not-
prescribing
right.
policy, correct?
Right.
And so it's very interesting. So the IPCC puts out reports every, say, 5 to 7 years, and since the time that it's been established, which was 1988, it's put out 5 such reports. They're called assessment reports, and they're referred to fondly as AR1, AR2, and the latest one was AR5. So the first one in 1990 that came about was very interesting because that was the first time such a effort had been undertaken, and it really played a crucial role in establishing the UNFCCC. So in essence, I would say the IPCC's first assessment report sort of gave birth to the UNFCCC process. And then in 1995, when the second one came out, it compiled material that led up to the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, and then so on. And then you were involved in the 2007 one, which was the AR4, the assessment report 4.
Even the
correct?
previous one, I think.
And
3
AR3. So 3 and 4, which AR3 came out in 2001 and AR4 in 2007. And really, that's when climate change and sustainable development got linked. 2014 has been, they've been taking out a report in slowly in parts, in 4 parts, and I think I'm still reading through the executive summary. So, but really, the AR4 I think is particularly interesting, 3 and 4, but 4 because it led to the IPCC being given a Nobel Peace Prize, which was shared by Al Gore. Or do you want to say that you shared Al Gore's prize? Well, whichever. But so how did it feel to be part of that committee that brought this to the world's attention?
Yeah, well, it was a different aspect we were focusing on. Al Gore was the one who wrote the book for the film and did the publicity of it. We were mainly the people who gathered the evidence for the IPCC. Mm-hmm. And it was very good to know that our work had been recognized by the international community, and so we were quite happy about that, of course.
Right, and so if we can see that first image, I think that's really exciting. Toufiq didn't really want me to put this out there, but this actually is the certificate, or is a picture of the certificate. So I guess you shared it with a few other people.
Yeah, we must have been quite a few others.
Right, but it's interesting because, so maybe I'll come back to this, but what was your role in the IPCC? You were writing the reports. I mean, could you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, I was one of the lead authors for the report dealing with technology assessment, and one with the mitigation strategies, that's energy-related material, how energy use could be maintained without emissions even going up all the time. And of course, the one way was to do it was to reduce the use of coal and oil. And another one was to use energy more efficiently. And third one was to increase the use of natural gas and renewable energy sources.
And we will talk about those renewable energy sources in our third segment. So don't go away. We're going to talk about how some of the work that Toufiq has done is being implemented, how he himself is working on the implementation of that. And we will also talk about the role of renewables and what's happening with that. So tweet us live here at ThinkTechHI and join the conversation. If you have questions for Toufiq, please send them in, and we'll be back right after the break. This is Climate Change Beyond Outrage.
Aloha, I'm Kaui Lucas, host of Hawaii is My Mainland, here on Think Tech Hawaii every Friday at 3 p.m. We address issues of importance for those of us who live here on the most isolated landmass on the planet. Please come join me Fridays at 3 p.m. Mahalo.
Okay, I'm Jay Fidel, that's Ray Starling. We co-host a show called Hawaii, the State of Clean Energy, every Wednesday, 4 to 5 p.m. It's really interesting. You know, Ray has a way of unzipping these guys. He asks them these questions, and all this stuff tumbles out, and we find out stuff we would never know about without Ray's questions. Thank you, Ray.
You're welcome, Jay. I'm very pleased to be your Ed McMahon every Wednesday at 4 o'clock here on the internet. So you can join us and see what's happening in the energy world, and there is a lot going on. So join us every Wednesday at 4 o'clock.
Yeah, come around, be energized right here on Think Tech. Aloha.
Welcome back to Climate Change Beyond Outrage, where we try to find solutions to climate problems facing people, nations, and the world. And in the studio today with me, I have Dr. Toufiq Siddiqi, who has worked with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and now is at the is an adjunct fellow at the East-West Center and chairman of a think tank here in Hawaii. So welcome back to the show. And before we go on to the role of, in this segment, we want to talk about how you've worked on implementing the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement and so on. But before we go on to that, I just wanted to mention the number of authors that had contributed to the first Ipcc assessment report. And it was 97 authors in that first AR1. So, and for AR5, which is the latest one, it was 831 authors and review editors. So it has grown by hundreds of authors and writers. And this is typical, I would say, of the climate process, right? Because even when you think about those global climate models, the GCMs, you're looking at how they were first not as complicated, and then you're adding on the role of, you know, the oceans, and you sort of keep adding more and more onto it. And it's, in some ways, the mandate for the Ipcc has also increased over the decades. So I just wanted to put that out there before we go onto the other topic. I thought you would be interested in hearing that statistic, Toufiq. So now you would indeed, if they got that Nobel Prize, they would be sharing it with 830 other people. So.
Well, I think they only get it once.
Well, good then that you got it, right? Okay, so so let's talk a little bit about the work that you've been doing on the implementation side. You have your role with the think tank, with the East-West Center, all of those. So I just, tell us about that.
Yeah, you mentioned the implementation of the Paris agreements. Those are fairly new agreements. As you know, you were there for yourself for the last one. It's about 2 months old. Yes. So you're not really been working on implementing it.
We need to get going on it.
Yeah, we need to. That's what I've been trying to say for the last couple of years. That,
right.
We need to make sure that the temporary drop in oil prices does not put back the cause of renewables as much as it did the first time around. You might recall I was in Hawaii actually at the time of the first oil crisis.
In the 70s?
In the 70s. Mm-hmm. And I was just here briefly on vacation with long lines of cars everywhere trying to get petrol.
Was it any different from the usual traffic jam?
Well, no, the traffic jam was not the main problem. The problem was getting enough gasoline.
Right.
So, and that time all the solar, the petroleum companies were getting into solar energy at the time, including Arco and even Exxon and Mobil, and all of these guys were into solar, or one because they thought that was going to be the future of energy. Then the price of oil went down, and they all dropped spun off their renewable energy arms and went back to being good old-fashioned oil companies again. So that's something we need to watch out for. That this time it's really a need. The challenge is a different one, not just an economic one, but one of survival of humankind. And I hope that we can continue with that. And what I've been doing is mainly working on trying to make people aware of what has happened in the renewable energy field. There's a lot of feeling that, well, renewable energy is fine, but it's way too expensive, and one of these days it will be a possible option for us, but not right now. And that was a thinking that prevailed for about 40 years. But I think the last 10 years have seen a dramatic change in that. And now we see that enormous increase in the use of renewables. There are equivalent of about 100 or more nuclear power plants already operating with solar photovoltaic cells. And that's, they're now the fastest growing sector in that and wind power are the fastest growing sector in electricity generation. And the investment in those sources now exceeds about $200 billion every year. So that's a huge amount. So I hope that momentum can be sustained.
Although I love to put numbers in context, and so when you say $200 billion, I want to bring up my favorite comparison, which is that just to give some sort of context to this, Americans in 2013 alone spent $83 billion on beer and $7 billion on potato chips. So together it's about $100 billion. So imagine 2 United States drinking beer and eating potato chips in a year, and that's what our investment in renewables is.
Yeah, that's true. It's not, I'm not talking about American investment alone. American investment has been lagging for quite a while.
So this is global.
Global investment.
You're saying this is globally.
Yeah, I'm thinking of this globally because I think the US has been, unfortunately, because of the strength of the oil lobby, this country has been not very able to move forward in spite of the interests of the policymakers. And the way the political system is arranged here, you can have a lot of opposition from it, from the vested interests against going with renewables.
Sure. Well, let me take you back to something you had said, which is that for about 40 years or so, investment and research in renewable energy was not as robust as it has been in the last 10 years. So what do you think has made that change? It's obviously, do you think that the UNFCCC and the role of the Ipcc and so on, all of these things have pushed the world more towards renewables, or was
I think the Ipcc is certainly an important factor in it, but I would say the fact that also technologies are becoming available. The role of technology is very important, and that you can't produce electricity from materials that were not very efficient at a reasonable cost. But the efficiency of silicon cells and gallium arsenide and so on have increased to a level that now that people can actually produce electricity at a roughly comparable rate to that of oil or coal in many places.
Mm-hmm. I also think it's interesting that, you know, when you started with all of this, renewables were really just a small portion on the horizon, just a little star kind of far away. And so now, of course, you've seen in your lifetime the growth of renewables. And actually, if, you know, I know we're sort of skipping ahead a little bit to what we were going to talk about, but I just wanted to go to our image, which is slide 10, not slide 4, but if it's possible to just bring up slide 10 and just look at the growth of renewables over the past 10 years. I just compiled this from the EIA and EIA.gov. And so this is, if we look at China, 2002 and 2012 numbers, if we look at China, this is the big 4 emitters. These are the growth in renewables electricity generation in billion kilowatt hours. So you're looking at China about 5 times, the US about, you know, a little less than double, the EU again about that much, sort of about double, and India, you know, going up from 72 to 160 billion kilowatt hours. So in the last 10 years, I mean, that's really jumped. And so I was just curious to make that link with, you know, so here you are with your perspective on things. I think you've in our conversations, you've told me that you think that you are much more optimistic than I am about this process. And I think that's interesting because I've been working on these issues, you know, not as long as you have, but as I think somewhat, you know, with some to bring some gravitas to the table. But for me, I am not at all optimistic, and I think that's because maybe I was ever since I've been conscious, renewables have been, you know, a big thing, and it's just not taking off like I might want to. So it's interesting. Maybe it's a generational thing, or maybe it's a, you know, just a personality thing. But I just thought it was interesting that you would find this whole process very optimistic, and I find it very. I'm not at all hopeful that we're going to make this goal.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons is that you've included in the renewables the hydropower, which is a traditional energy source now. The figures that you show probably include mainly hydropower. And about 70% to 80% of the electricity generated now still is hydropower from renewables. So if you take out the rest of it, it's going much faster, enormously faster. For example, I think the numbers are there in some of the next charts that I put down.
Right. So what we'll do is maybe
look at slide 10 first.
Slide 10 is where we were. Yes, you have some numbers on the renewables and so on. If we could just go on to slide 11. Is that the renewable power capacity in the top 7 countries?
Yeah. So you look at those. Wind power is roughly. Its total capacity is of all the renewables. We are calling these modern renewables, incidentally, the non-hydropower renewables, solar, wind, and biopower.
I see.
And geothermal to some extent. So these are increasing really fast and have gone up by a factor of about 10, I would say, in the last 10 years, 20 years, rather than the doubling that you referred to.
Okay.
So the growth trajectory is going that way rather than that way. So that's a reasonable cause for optimism. And you can look at the individual ones of those in the next 2 slides, if you like.
Yes.
That would be number 12 is wind capacity. For example, in India now there are about 25 or so gigawatt. Each gigawatt roughly represents the equivalent of 1 nuclear power plant. So these are being added at an enormously fast rate. China has over 100 gigawatt capacity. And the US also, so Germany. And if you look at the next one, which is the photovoltaics, then you can see that Germany is now the leader in photovoltaic capacity because they've made a conscious decision not to build nuclear power plants. And they've taken off quite fast, even though it's very expensive in Europe because the kind of climate conditions are such that there's a lot more cloud cover but it can still get reasonable amount. This represents only the capacities rather than the actual production of electricity. So those are the reasons why I'm more optimistic, is that solar power and wind power capacities have now really taken off, and it's going to be difficult for people to stop that.
Well, I have some more pessimistic things to add to that. So when we come back from this next break, we will talk about my pessimistic view and see what you think of that. And so you are watching Climate Change Beyond Outrage with Anu Hittel, and still to come on this show is really looking at the role of renewables in achieving our goals for climate change solutions globally. So don't go away, we'll be back.
Aloha! Hello, my name is Patrick Bratton. I'm host of Global Connections here at ThinkTech Hawaii. We broadcast live every Thursday at 1 p.m. We bring Hawaii to the world and the world to Hawaii, talking about international events and various things of interest to the audience. Please join me. I look forward to talking with you and having you get to meet some of my guests. Aloha.
Hi, I'm Donna Blanchard. I'm the host of Center Stage here on ThinkTech Hawaii. I hope that you will tune in and watch the show. It is inspiring and uplifting and educational also. We talk with artists of all different ilk. We talk with them about what they do, how they do it, and most importantly, most dear to my heart, why they do it. And it never ceases to be fascinating when you get the answer to that question. I hope you'll join us on Center Stage, 2 o'clock Wednesday afternoons. Aloha.
Welcome back to Climate Change Beyond Outrage with Anu Hittal, and I'm here in the studio with Dr. Toufiq Siddiqi, and we are talking about the prequel to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and we're talking about what's after, what's beyond Paris. And so we were talking about the role of renewables, and Toufiq is, we decided over the break that it really doesn't have to do with generation or personality or nothing like that, but it really has more to do with the fact that, did you want to say?
Social scientists tend to be more pessimistic generally because of their focus on human nature, and natural scientists more have greater faith in technology and what it can achieve.
Right.
So maybe that's a professional difference.
So it's a professional difference that we're having, which is that I'm in that social scientist category, being pessimistic about this. So let me show you a couple of pessimistic pictures.
Right.
And if we could look at slide 14. This is just something I pulled out of EIA again, and it's 2012 numbers. It really looks at the renewables, the total energy consumption in China, for example. So I'm just going to the biggest emitter right now, which is China. 66% coal, oil is 20%, hydroelectric is 8%, natural gas 5%, nuclear less than 1%, and renewables 1%. So that growth in renewables, I mean, this is China, where they really like coal, right? And it does say, even in the March 12th issue of The Economist, they said that China has done like a 73% increase in its renewables in the last, I don't know, several years. But I still feel like, you know, if you have 73% on 1%, you're not really going to get very far in that equation, right? And so if we look at I won't go through all the countries, but I'll just look at one more, which is the United States. And here we've got renewable energy at 10%. So they are counting hydroelectric in that. So if you took hydroelectric out of that, that would be even less than 10%. So we've got China at 1%. We've got the US at, say, 10%, if we're going to be generous about this. So between 1% and 10%, okay, and we don't need to see the slide anymore, but between 1% and 10% is what we're looking at for renewable energy. And we're looking at trying to solve a global climate problem where the clock is ticking. And we're trying to stay under that 2 degrees Celsius goal, which is the collective goal that all nations have agreed on, at least all that are party to the UNFCCC. So I would ask the natural scientists to sort of make me feel better.
Okay. The 2-degree goal is probably not achievable in the short term. But we will probably overshoot that goal. But I'm optimistic in terms of being able to say that we have a good possibility of bringing it for in about 30 to 40 years, of reducing the carbon dioxide emissions enough to bring the curve gradually down again.
To bring the system back into
some sort of closer to where it is
No.
perhaps today, or maybe even later on.
And you think this would happen with things like carbon sequestration and storage, or some kind of technology breakthrough, some kind of miracle?
That's not miracles. I think just changing the emissions patterns drastically would reduce the amount of carbon dioxide being emitted, but there's a lot of it which would continue to be in the atmosphere for decades.
Mm-hmm.
And that will still continue to be a problem for us. But I'm not saying that things will get better in our lifetimes, but probably the next generation has a good possibility that it will be much better off than we are, simply because they have the alternative available. And China's, you're looking at 72% now of energy coming from coal. It used to be more like 78% a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So that's quite an achievement in itself to decrease that. And they have not decided not to increase any more coal consumption. That is one of the reasons for the disagreements between China and India on the one hand, and the United States on the other hand, was to give them enough time to reach the development goals and then start cutting back. And China is much further along the path, of course, having achieved the distinction of having the largest emitter of carbon dioxide.
Right. So, so according to you, this march of renewables, it's going to sort of take over, and this transition is going to happen. Because really, the problem is not that the technology is not there. We have the technology. It's just how is that transition going to happen, and when? Because is it going to happen soon enough for us to be able to dial back and achieve our goals? Is it going to happen? And you've already sort of touched on that. But have you sort of thought about how is that going to look? What's going to need to happen for us to get there?
I think what's happening is that the U.S. has been the major obstacle in getting a treaty ratified. This is even now, Paris is only an agreement because they're sure that the U.S. Congress would never approve a treaty that would commit the countries to doing these, because there's no likelihood of the Senate ever ratifying it in the near future. So politically, that's one of the problems. The other thing is that China has reached a stage now where it's already suffering enormously from the pollution, local effects of large-scale use of coal. So that and Delhi also has the same. Some parts of India have the same problem of not being able to breathe the air that you're putting out. So that's pressure on the governments in those countries also to do something about it. I think these will combine to exert pressure on all the countries to reduce their emissions of local pollutants, and concomitantly with that will be the emission reductions in CO2. And hopefully that will provide enough basis to have in the next 40 years or so a trend of decreasing emissions.
All right. Well, so you're going to keep hoping.
Yeah.
And I'm also going to keep hoping. But when you look back on all the decades of work that you have done on this issue, what do you feel is the most significant, or maybe not the most significant, but maybe 2 or 3 of the most significant things that stand out for you as part of that process?
I think first was the UN conference in Stockholm in 1992, which defined the fact that we all live in a sustainably, dangerously world where sustainability is being threatened. I think that was a big press step forward. It was at Rio. I think that was Rio.
That's right.
Stockholm was 72.
That's right.
And so that 20 years period has been an important one in the transforming people's thinking. And you'll find that the newer generation is much more aware of this everywhere than people of my generation were. So that's very helpful sign. And they go back and tell their parents to switch off the lights and not waste energy and so on. And the next one would be the climate change agreements, what Kyoto Protocol first initially. And the reason it was never implemented was because countries could not reconcile their economic aspirations with their environmental aspirations. But that's now been taken care of to a large extent by the development process having been reached a level where it's in the country's own interest to do something.
That's right.
And so those are a couple of highlights. And then the third one would be the fact that technologies have now become available, and the dissemination of technology helped by the internet has become so widespread, and the communications media have become so ubiquitous that we know everywhere what's happening anywhere.
That's right. And so I think that it will be interesting to see how and when and how long it will take us to make that transition from the old structure into this new structure. I mean, we did get away from whale oil, so we should be able to get away from coal eventually. So we're going to wrap it up here, but before we do that, I just wanted to mention, I just wanted to end with a quote from Nelson Mandela, which I think is suited to the occasion. It was quoted again by the president of the COP21, Laurent Fabius, and he says, Nelson Mandela says, "It always seems impossible until it's done." And then also would like to add, by the same person, by Nelson Mandela, that none of us acting alone can achieve success. And so I think that that's something that you've been doing, is working as a team with your colleagues for decades. And you know, it's really the work of people like you that has brought us to where we are now. So for that, we thank you, and thank you for being here on the show.
Thank you very much for that kind thought, and I'm glad you brought up the fact that it's just a large community, and the larger this community grows of you working on this field, the more likelihood we have of bringing success.
That's right. So we hope that all you budding climate scientists and sociologists and climate anythings will be working on this issue, because we need everybody to work on it to find a solution. So you are watching Climate Change Beyond Outrage, and we are here every Tuesday at 1 o'clock live, and then we get archived on the YouTube channel at thinktech.com, thinktechhawaii.com. So aloha, namaskar, and goodbye.